Welcome back, Thing players and Thing watchers, and happy Mum's Day to any maternally inclined critters among you. I'm here once again, with apologies for being quiet last week. I was feeling a little off my feed for the weekend and needed to rest up a bit. Today, however, I am back, following up that lengthy Dark Souls run with a single-serving installment of Double Dragon. I do hope you don't mind that I'm not exactly plumbing the depths of obscurity here, but this is a game dear to my heart, and an important, genre-defining piece of history, and I felt like giving it a little love. Double Dragon began life as a 1987 arcade game developed by Technos Japan Corporation and published outside of Japan by Taito. It is, to the best of my knowledge, the first belt-scrolling beat-em-up of the form we recognize today. The very first brawler with 8-directional movement was 1986's Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun, aka Renegade in the West, also designed by Yoshihisa Kishimoto for Technos. However, Renegade was more of an arena sort of beat-em-up, in which you fought enemies in a single-room environment until a boss eventually joined the fracas, then moved on to the next static location. It wasn't until Double Dragon that we saw progression through lengthy and varied scrolling environments, with a boss waiting at the end, a format that would be adopted to great success by such descendants as Final Fight, Konami's Simpsons and Ninja Turtles games, Streets of Rage, and many more. I often hear Double Dragon employed as a sort of shorthand for shallow and outdated by games writers with a shitty sense of history. While many of its successors certainly did build upon the foundation laid by Double Dragon, making it seem somewhat basic by comparison, I think it's damned impressive how well it does hold up. The graphics and music are outstanding by 1987 standards, and the mechanics remain solid and tight. For my money, it's still fun to play nearly 3 decades later, and that's quite an accomplishment. Since Double Dragon moves at a brisk pace with an average playthrough lasting only 20 to 30 minutes, I may be stopping from time to time to impart a nugget of history or trivia that I wouldn't have time for otherwise. I do beg your pardon for breaking up the flow, and I hope you'll find this an interesting and enjoyable trip nonetheless. Now then, let's punch some dudes, shall we? Ah, the legendary gut punch at the English tier. That's the hero's girlfriend, Marion. We'll talk more about the characters and story in a bit because we have more immediate concerns. And it's already time for our first trivia break. Back in '87, this was quite the get hype moment. You see Marion get busted in the gut, the garage door rolls up, your cool car goes vroom vroom, and you're all revved up to bust some heads. A classic and well-remembered intro, to be sure, but what you may not know is, this isn't just any cool car, but a subtle reference to a game Yoshihisa Kishimoto previously directed during his time at Data East. That would be the 1984 Dragon's Lair-style Laserdisc game, Road Blaster, not to be confused with Atari's 1987 Road Blasters, and better known for its retitled Sega CD port Road Avenger, ably LP'd by Frank-O-Matic. As QTE-based FMV games go, I'd call Road Blaster one of the more enjoyable ones, thanks to its fast pace, good first-person animation, and non-stop parade of batshit insane stunts, including ramping through an attack helicopter and playing hide-and-seek with a fleet of gigantic combine harvesters. There's a very similar reference in the intro of 1988's Double Dragon 2: The Revenge. The hangar with helicopter is a nod to Thunderstorm, another of Kishimoto-san's 1984 Laserdisc projects for Data East. Thunderstorm was released as Cobra Command outside of Japan, and like Road Blaster, is more recognized for its Sega CD port than it ever was in the arcade. Back to the show with our hero Billy Lee, aka Hammer. We've got our basic punch combo, which is 3 punches followed by an uppercut. There's also a kick combo, which is just 2 hits, a kick to the face and then a spin kick to the face for the knockdown. Jump and punch at the same time does an elbow behind you, which is a horribly broken move that I'll talk more about later. And jump and kick at the same time does a spin kick behind you, which is very powerful but not as broken as the elbow. There's the headbutt, which usually comes out by accident and is not terribly useful. And if you stun an enemy, you can do up to 3 knees to the head, or you can just grab and throw them. For maximum damage, you'll want to do 2 knees and then the throw. And of course we have a jump kick. Now our basic fodder enemy here is Williams, named after Jim Kelly's character in Enter the Dragon. Lots of Enter the Dragon references. And here we have Linda. If you've ever played Double Dragon Neon, you may recall the shopkeeper chastising you for grabbing women by the hair and beating them up in the past. But in this original arcade version, you'll notice that isn't actually possible. Linda always falls down before she enters a grabbable state. And freeze. Now, the lofty gentleman who just busted through the wall like a roided-out Kool-Aid man, we all know who that is, don't we? Only the most celebrated and iconic of all Double Dragon villains. Who else could it be but a Bobo, right? Well, maybe? The truth is surprisingly murky. See, there are a number of characters sharing the same basic body type, and which of them, if any, is the one true Abobo is obfuscated by a ton of conflicting information. I've done more research on this subject than I really like to think about, and the results are inconclusive. To try and elucidate the matter, we shall now delve into the dark fledgling science of Abobology. For starters, we have this tall, muscular fellow with a bald head and a Fu Manchu mustache, typically a white guy. In the NES version, this is the only giant character, and is consistently identified as a Bobo. Fair enough. The NES style Abobo is also the one assuming the title role in the indie hit Abobo's Big Adventure. So far, so good. However, in the arcade original, there's another giant, typically a black guy, with a mohawk and full beard that make him look like Mr. T and big round eyes. On top of that, they're behaviorally different. Only Baldy can throw big objects like oil drums, while only Mr. T can box your ears with a two-handed slap attack. In other words, they seem to be different characters. Now, depending on who you ask, either both of them are a Bobo, or one of them is named Bolo, which would be another Enter the Dragon reference, the big scary dude played by Bolo Yeung, who you might also know as Chong Li from Bloodsport. Some sources identify Baldy as Bolo, and some assign the name to Mr. T. Personally, I'm inclined to say if anyone is Bolo, it's probably Baldy. Reason being, the GBA remake, Double Dragon Advance, identifies a jolly green giant as Mibobo, presumably a portmanteau of Midori and Abobo. So if that guy is Green Bobo, then the more terrestrially complected version is probably a Bobo, or so my logic goes. Your mileage may vary. Just to round things out, there's a long-haired version of the Fu Manchu guy in Double Dragon 2, who I've seen dubbed Bolo and Abobo, each about half the time, so that's no help. And tangentially, but just for your enlightenment, there's one more head swap in Double Dragon 2, this baby-faced sweetheart, who has been definitively identified as O'Hara, giving us yet another Enter the Dragon reference. So, who the hell is a Bobo anyway? Who, if anyone, is Bolo? Well, if you've got any hard data from an official source, I'd be delighted if you'd share. In the meantime, I think we can all agree that the true Abobo lives in our hearts, and in the smiles of children everywhere. And again, back to the show. Here we see one of the other things that Double Dragon introduced to the genre, the addition of weapons that can be picked up by both the enemies and yourself. In this case, we have the baseball bat, and just a moment ago I had the whip. This was something that was carried on into pretty much every beat-em-up that followed, the main exception that comes to mind being Konami's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But Final Fight had them, Simpsons had them, pretty much everything had them, but Double Dragon was the first to do it, as it was the first to do many things in this particular type of game. And you can barely see just the bottom of it, but there was a billboard for Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun there. Here we are introduced to the knife, which is strictly a throwing weapon. You can't stab with it in this game. But it does a ton of damage and will one-shot just about any normal enemy, and do a goodly amount of damage to bosses and mid-bosses. And there's our first boss, the Mr. T variant of the big guy, whether he is Bolo or a Bobo. And the other fellow with the spiked jacket, that is Roper, If you're mainly familiar with the NES game, you may know him as Lopar, but that is just a clumsy romanization. He should be Roper because that is yet another Enter the Dragon reference, the down-on-his-luck playboy played by John Saxon. And as you've seen, the oil drums here are a type of weapon, the heavy object, that can be kicked across the ground or picked up and hurled. Only Roper and the Baldy Giant, be he Bolo or Bobo, can actually handle those objects. Moving on to Mission 2, this is a particularly short level. It'll just be a real speedy breeze through without a whole lot to talk about, so let's go into the story briefly. In the year 19XX, most of the world's population died as a result of a nuclear war, and civilization entered a new era of crime and violence. At the center of this civilization, there was a gang called the Black Warriors, whose origins are unknown. The Black Warriors started terrorizing ordinary citizens, and the law was powerless to stop them. However, two young men were strong enough to confront them. Their names were Billy and Jimmy Lee, the Double Dragons. Trained in Chinese martial arts, the Lee brothers protected citizens from the Black Warriors' attacks. The brothers also trained citizens to defend themselves from the Black Warriors through their Sosetsuken Dojo. Among the Lee brothers' students, there was a female instructor named Marion. Marion had a love affair with Billy Lee. The Black Warriors decided to take advantage of the opportunity. One day, the Black Warriors attacked the city and took Marion as a hostage to lure the Lee brothers to their hideout. Now Billy must go out alone or enlist the help of his brother Jimmy to defeat the Black Warriors and save Marion. Well, there you have it. Even though you'd never know it to just look at the game, this is meant to be a post-apocalyptic scenario, showing that yes, pretty much every fucking thing in Japan in the 80s was in some way influenced by Fist of the North Star. Also, it gives a name to our villains, the Black Warriors, and as a rather literal-minded 9-year-old in 1987, I always wondered why, if they were the Black Warriors, they had so many white people in them. And here you will find us already at the end of Mission 2, where there's a conveyor belt that can drop enemies or yourself to some presumably horrible fate. Another thing I always wondered about as a child was what exactly happened at the other end of that conveyor belt, if it was just a deep hole or if there was some kind of machinery there that would mangle you beyond recognition. You know how at that sort of age your imagination likes to fill in the gaps and can insert all sorts of horrors where there might not be any intended. And once we've gotten the second elevator full of gang members at this point, the boss also comes up on that little elevator platform at the bottom, and this is Jeff. Jeff is simply a head swap of the Lee brothers, and he has all of your moves, although he uses them a little differently. Jeff is also one of the lesser known of the Double Dragon villains because he doesn't appear in most of the adaptations. In particular, in the NES version, he was replaced by a Chinese martial artist named Chin Taimei. Why, I have no idea. But yes, being a head swap, there's not a whole lot to say about Jeff, but one thing that's notable about him is that he has a fairly unique ability shared only by the end boss. Unless his health is almost completely exhausted and he's very near death, you've seen if you try and grab him, he will just shake off your grip. However, once he's almost dead, you can grab, knee, and toss him just like anybody else. Like I said, there's very, very little to Mission 2, you just kind of blow right through it. Mission 3 will be taking us into the forest outside of town. And again, there's not a whole lot that's new that's introduced in this level, so I think I'll talk a little bit about my introduction to Double Dragon, which I did indeed encounter for the first time in 1987, and I remember it fairly vividly. I know I was in a Hills at the time. We're a different kind of department store. You ought to be shopping Hills. Check us out. For those among you young enough to have missed it, or those of you who were just never in the eastern half of the United States during the time, Hills was a chain of discount stores that was around from the 50s through the late 90s. It was a lot like a Target, but in 98 or 99 it was bought out by Ames, and then just a few years later Ames itself went bankrupt, and that was the end of Hills. But back in the day, Hills was a staple of my youth because my mom did a lot of shopping there. And much like Target does today, you had a snack bar sort of area out in front where you could get like a hot dog or a hot pretzel or an icy. And every Hills I was ever in had exactly 2 arcade games, one at either end of the lobby and snack bar area. A lot of the time they were pretty good games, pretty contemporary. They seemed to get new releases as often as not. And so it was Hills where I first encountered Double Dragon, and the graphics and everything were impressive to me, but I remember what really stood out to me at the time, what really kind of blew my 9-year-old mind, was that enemies got back up. Like, holy shit. At the time, I had not yet encountered Renegade in the wild, so every game I had ever seen up to that point, whenever an enemy fell down, that meant they were knocked out or dead or whatever, and you were done with them. But in this game, suddenly you were encountering enemies that you would beat up on them and knock them down, and they would get back up and keep fighting. And I was like, holy shit. It was like the most hardcore thing I had ever seen. As a matter of fact, and I remember this very, very vividly, my reaction to Double Dragon was, am I even allowed to play this? Like, will I get in trouble if I put a quarter into this? Because, it just seemed so hardcore to me and rather unusually violent. And so, I'm like, this seems like it should be for grown-ups or at least teenagers. I'm not sure I'm allowed to play this. And as a matter of fact, at the time, I didn't play it. I think it was at the same Hills that on a later visit I did get up my gumption to finally give Double Dragon a try, and I found, no harm or punishment befell me, and I quite enjoyed it. And from then on, it was a game I enjoyed very much. But, I thought maybe I shouldn't be messing around with this. Anyway, I kind of miss Hills. It was, I have many good memories of the place. It was the first place I encountered eSWAT, as far as I can remember. No, you know what, that was the first place I encountered eSWAT that I could play on any kind of regular basis. I had seen it once at a mall before then. But, whenever my mom would go shopping there, which, again, was a fairly regular occurrence, I would, just maybe get an icy, and depending on the state of my pocket change, I would either go and play one of their games for a while in the lobby, or just watch someone else play games in the lobby. Because there were always, other kids there at Hills who were, spending some of their time while the family was shopping with the arcade games in the lobby. But, yep. Just a lot of good memories there. According to legend, the little folks know Hills is where the toys are. Yes, I do hope you don't mind terribly that sometimes I get on these, rambling Grandpa Simpson stories where I'm only tangentially talking about the game, but, so much of my, youthful experiences are tied up in arcade games and, the early consoles, but I was definitely a big arcade rat as a kid, and, folks growing up today when arcades are basically dead and just, there's maybe Dave & Buster's here and there, and the turkey hunting and big buck hunting games, and maybe an old Golden Tee machine here and there, and that's about it. That's really kind of sad to me. It was a different time, and there's something about it that I think really can't be recaptured at home, but I'm probably sounding like an old fart back in my day, etc., etc. And I am growing disturbingly close to 40, I find. Maybe in the long term, if I keep doing this, and I certainly intend to keep doing this for a while, I'll becomes something like gamer dad to people, I don't know. I can think of worse fates. And here you see Bolo, which is what I'm going to call the Baldi version, is able to pick up the heavy object things like the oil drums and boulders, which the Mr. T variant, which I'm just going to stick with Abobo for, cannot actually do. And as I mentioned before, we haven't seen it yet, but the Mr. T Abobo does have a two-handed bell clap type attack that the Bolo version cannot do. And also you hear, or rather you see me making excessive use of the elbow attack, which as I've mentioned before is incredibly broken. I have had to continue, as you can see. I'm not playing to the best of my ability because I'm trying to vary up my movesets and keep things a little interesting. But Double Dragon is actually not a very difficult game to one credit if you play carefully and spam the elbow very frequently. The reason the elbow is so broken is not only does it do decent damage, but the AI has no idea how to react to it. Like, as you can see here, if you do punches or kicks, or even jump kicks and the spin kick, most attacks in general, the AI does have a little bit of a defensive sense to it. It'll try and back away from your attacks, or duck some of the high ones, generally try to avoid being hit. But the elbow, it'll just walk into it like you're doing absolutely nothing. It just doesn't even recognize that the elbow is something that'll hurt it, so you can just spam the elbow and just knock the enemy down over and over again, and there is nothing they will ever be able to do about it. Double Dragon 2 kept the elbow but nerfed it considerably. The AI has a little more sense about avoiding it, but it still walks right into the elbow more often than not. It's more surprised by it than by any other move, so even in Double Dragon 2, when it had been considerably nerfed, the elbow is still ridiculously powerful. But then, of course, Double Dragon 2 has its own broken move, which is the helicopter kick. If you've ever played it, you know what I mean. I suppose I should also take a moment to talk about the fact that Double Dragon 2 was one of the first two-player simultaneous co-op games I ever encountered. I don't know if there were any other quite like it beforehand. I know it certainly seemed revolutionary to me at the time. Well, there was, I take that back, there definitely was the original Mario Brothers, which was a two-player co-op game before Double Dragon came along. But certainly it was the first two-player co-op beat-em-up. And as a matter of fact, that was something people were really pissed about when the 8-bit port came out. The NES version had a special player versus player duel option, but the main game, the sort of campaign mode as you might say, it did not have two-player simultaneous gameplay at all. You would take turns like in most two-player games. And I remember a lot of people were super disappointed by that, and would derisively call the game Single Dragon. Matter of fact, the SMS version did have the two-player co-op, and that was a selling point for it. I remember TV commercials for the Master System saying they had two-player Double Dragon. Actually, the NES version was really different in general. It was kind of loosely based on the arcade version. Pretty good game in its own right, though, even if people who were actually looking for an arcade port were kind of disappointed by it, including myself at the time. But eventually I grew to appreciate it for what it was. And now we're coming up on the end of Mission 3, where we encounter the aforementioned Mibobo, who is basically just a green and slightly faster and more powerful Abobo. Has the standard suplex and so on. But they give you a boulder to work with, which can definitely help. And of course he is super vulnerable to the elbow, just like everybody else. Something interesting about this guy that you can see a little more in him than in most enemies. A lot of enemies will get up really fast when they have full health, but as you wear them down, it starts taking them longer and longer to get back to their feet, which I just think is a neat touch. And on we go to the fourth and final mission, which is distinguished mainly by its traps, which as you can see can pop out and knock you flying at a moment's notice, and they hurt a lot. These blocks you can kind of bait out by walking along toward the bottom of the screen and just getting out of the way when you see them start to move, but they still come out pretty fast, so it's not easy. And these spear-wielding statues here, they will one-shot you. If you get hit by that spear, you just straight up die. So it's very easy, if you're careless about those, to lose a lot of credits here just getting stabbed over and over again. On the other hand, the enemies do set them off, cause them to stab as well, and they are as dangerous to the enemies as they are to you. So that's a plus. Also, you do need to mind the spiked chasm at the bottom of the screen, which will kill you, of course, if you walk into it, just like any sort of falling hazard in the game. Case in point. And here we have a Bobo doing his best Dogi impersonation. I don't know what an impersonation is. But yes, magnificent wall crushers they are. And dealing with a pair of them is not the easiest thing in the world, so this is an excellent place to abuse the elbow. Especially because you likely don't have any weapons to play with at this point. If you're fast and you don't... Oh, there was the bell clap. But if you're fast and don't advance the screen too much, it is possible to use that sort of lip in the spike pit and knock one or both of them into it, but it is definitely much easier said than done. In most cases, you're just going to have to fight them unless you're very good about your spacing. And something in this game that has always made me laugh was the sound they make when they suplex you. Ugh. Almost sounds like a slightly angrier version of Krusty the Clown's exasperated sigh. I'm really going through a lot of credits here, but I suppose that'll happen when you play the game for demonstration purposes rather than really put your all into one credit clearing it, rather. Yeah, it's really a very fair game, I would say, especially compared to a lot of beat-em-ups. It's not terribly hard to one credit, but it is a challenge. And now we enter the final chamber, pardon my English. And in the final chamber, the theme from Double Dragon, one of the more beloved pieces of 80s video game music, begins to play. Da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da, etc. And if we go into the upper right here, we can see the final boss, Willie Mackey, the big boss of the Black Warriors. Now, one of the big urban legends of the arcades back in the day was that there was some kind of secret door or hidden passage you could open here that would let you up onto the balcony, and you could steal the machine gun up there. This is not entirely true. I only recently discovered that if you position yourself just right and get him to throw you at just the right angle, it is possible to get Bolo to suplex you up onto the balcony, and you can aggro Willie early. Now, this is not actually a particularly good thing to do. You definitely cannot take and use the machine gun, but you can aggro Willie early, but if he knocks you back down to the floor before you kill him, then you can't beat the game because he gets stuck up there and you can't hurt him anymore. Anyway, when you've taken out the three generic thugs on the ground level, and they all get replaced with Jeffs, that is when Willie comes down from the balcony and starts to attack you, and yes, he does have a machine gun. And yes, that machine gun will just straight up kill you, which is reasonable enough. Your saving grace here is that Willie does not often use the machine gun at close range. As long as you stick fairly close to him, he will usually try and super kick you or just whack you with the rifle. I like Willie. He's, next to a Bobo, probably the most iconic character of Double Dragon, at least for me. I mean, he's a grizzled-looking dude with a spiked shoulder pad, and he can kill you in one shot, and, I mean, he brings an automatic rifle to a street fight, and there's a certain ruthlessness to that. Double Dragon Neon, the most recent game in the series, I am actually quite a big fan of, although it was not critically well received, it seems. But I like it a lot, but one of my biggest regrets about Double Dragon Neon is that they didn't find any way to work in Willy. I mean, I love Skullmageddon, but it's just not a Double Dragon throwback to me without Willy Mackey. I think, at the very least, they should have made him out to be sort of a fake main villain, so that, you know, you could defeat him and then maybe Skullmageddon shows up and I was behind it all along! Or something to that effect. But that's just me. When you beat up Willy, all the Jeffs try and take a powder. You can still kill them, but, at long last, Marion is free. You get your hot makeout session and late 80s early video game panty shot. And may you live happily forever. Of course, that's only if you're playing a single-player game. If you're playing 2 players, at the point that Willy is defeated, all the Jeffs are either defeated or get the hell out of Dodge, then you will have to fight player versus player to the death. Animeter? Anyway, yeah, that was a bit of a surprise the first time I ever got to the end of the game with a co-op partner. If I understand correctly, the official story maintains that Billy is Marion's actual boyfriend, but both Jimmy and Marion kind of carry a torch for each other, so I guess they have to settle it in a fight to the death to see who her affections will truly stay with in the end. Kind of a bummer. Brothers, you know, brought to blows in a battle to the death over Marion, but I guess that's the way it goes sometimes. So, that is Double Dragon. Again, a very genre-defining game. Its effects were felt for as long as beat-em-ups continued to come out. And again, I think it really is quite enjoyable even today. A little bit rudimentary in some ways, but the challenge level is just about right in my humble opinion. The mechanics are still pretty solid. It's got some slowdown, as you can see in the attract mode here, especially in 2-player when you have 2 players and lots of enemies wandering around at the same time. But good graphics. One of the first games, I think, to have you know, a very varied and memorable soundtrack from beginning to end. Just good stuff, and I don't think it deserves the reputation that it seems to have today as an unworthy relic of a bygone era. Area? I mean era. Having problems with my language again. Anyway, that's enough of that. I do highly recommend Double Dragon Neon, which is now available for all kinds of platforms. Most of the other sequels were not particularly exciting. Double Dragon 3 in the arcade was outright terrible, although the Nintendo game was actually decent. But anyway, I do think Neon is the most worthy of the follow-ups, and I have to say, making Billy and Jimmy into lovable meatheads a la Bill and Ted was a fairly inspired decision. So, yeah, if you got a few bucks burning a hole in your pocket, by all means give it a shot. Alternately, Deceased Crab did a nice LP of it if you'd prefer to absorb it that way. But, to wrap up the subject of this Double Dragon, I hope you've enjoyed this journey, however rambling and digressive, back to one of my favorite little genre revolutions of the coin-op age. Until next time, this is Un. I thank you very much for watching, and that's game, Hendrix. As always, I would like to thank my very generous patrons, including Justin Carpenter, Nolden, Zangamarth, Charlie Dunst, Anonymous Benefactor, John Madigan, Johnny Millennium, Sanguine Games, Joseph Coco, Misha Van Doren, Craig Patterson, Frank Grizzy, Tim J., Lolo De Puzzlo, and new arrival Joshua C. Ritchie. Welcome. And thank you to all of my other patrons, and all you watchers, subscribers, and commenters out there. As always, I'm glad to have you along, and I hope to see you next game. Till then, take care.